and welcome to the Southeastern Symposium. This paper will be given by PhD student Robb Coleman and is entitled In All Things Variety, Translation Technique in the Greek Translation of Leviticus 17 through 26. We're excited to have you. Before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to our sponsor, InterVarsity Press. As a part of their response to COVID-19, they've created a Together reading list, and I've put a link for that in the chat. It's 40% off a number of books, and they have free US shipping, so feel free to check that out. My name is Christy Thornton, and I'm a PhD student here at Southeastern. We're really excited to host Robb for his paper today. Robb is a current PhD student in Old Testament, but he also did the Master of Arts in Old Testament that helped prepare him. If you're interested in master's programs that lead to PhDs in Old Testament, our Master of Arts in Old Testament prepares students for further academic study of the Old Testament when they're prepared for doctoral work in related fields, teaching at the undergraduate level, and using the Old Testament in vocational ministry. And I'll drop a link for a little bit of more information about that in the chat as well. Well, if this is your first time in one of our papers, I'm going to talk you through the Q&A process. So Robb's going to give his paper in just a minute, and then we'll have some time for you to ask questions. Now, we wanted to give you an opportunity to voice those questions yourself, but this is how the process will work. If you look at the bottom toolbar, you'll see that you have a little button that says Q&A. You can click on that and start typing in some questions. You don't need to give us a super long version. You can give us an 8 to 10 word version of the question. And then I'll pick some of those questions. If your question is chosen, I'll type in, "This is a good question. We'll answer that next. Please raise your hand." And at that point, if you'll raise your hand on the toolbar at the bottom, there's a little raise your hand feature. And then I'll actually unmute you and give you the opportunity to speak your question to Robb directly. And at that point, you can give a little bit more of the context and, the scholarly mumbo jumbo that's necessary for asking academic questions. So that's how it'll work. Feel free to drop questions at any point during Robb's paper, and then we'll choose once we get to the end and give you an opportunity to be able to ask Robb directly. Well, without further delay, I give you PhD student Robb Coleman.
Right, I'm going to share my screen. So Christy, when I do that, can you just confirm that it is shared and visible to all? How about now?
Boom, perfect, you're good to go.
All right, so you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, now you're good to click through it.
All right, let's just hope it doesn't get ahead of itself. Okay. All right, so groupthink threatens all academic disciplines. Septuagint studies is no exception. The characterization of the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible as either literal or free represents one form of groupthink that has long dominated the field. These parameters are simplistic and they do not explicate the nature of the translation technique of an individual book in the Greek Bible. This paper attempts to discourage Septuagint scholars from accepting the literal versus free translation technique groupthink that is still common in our discipline. Instead, it suggests that the study of Septuagint translation technique should be the study of the characteristics, habits, and practices of a Greek translator in his translation of an individual book of the Hebrew Bible. So the paper proceeds in two stages. First, it surveys the translation technique of the Greek translator of Leviticus 17 to 26. This corpus represents a significant portion of the text of Leviticus, 10 chapters, 335 verses, which allows one to draw reliable conclusions about the characteristics, habits, and practices of the Greek translator of Leviticus. Second, the paper analyzes the translation of Leviticus 25, 44 to 46 in light of the conventions that the translator utilizes in Leviticus 17 to 26, since I am conducting research on Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. This study shows that the Greek translator of Leviticus utilized a variety of traceable patterns in his translation. However, the key to his translation method is variety itself. So, the translation technique of the Greek translation of the Holiness Code. This section begins with a few examples of the translator's general tendency towards variety, in which variety is the most plausible explanation for the translator's decisions. It then outlines the broadest characteristics of the translation, which can be explained with reference to something other than simple variety. Nevertheless, these characteristics often diametrically oppose one another, again demonstrating that the translator's mantra is, in all things, variety. So this section covers 4 types of variety in the Greek translation of Leviticus: lexical, semantic, syntactic, and textual variation. The examples were randomly selected since there were numerous options to choose from. Moreover, the Greek translator demonstrates variety in other ways in his translation. Thus, these examples simply exemplify his general tendency towards variety. I have reduced the number of examples for the sake of time. So first, lexical variation. The Greek translator shows free variation in the translation of individual lexemes, consistency in the translation of certain lexemes, but inconsistency with other lexemes, and variation in the translation of number. So as one example, the Greek translator translates the noun chok, or statute, as nomimos, prostagma, namas, tikaioma, krima, and one time he translates the noun as autois, to them, pronoun. Free variation appears to be the best explanation for these translations. The Greek translator also shows free variation in the translation of verbs. He translates the verb gor, to sojourn, as proskemai, proskenomai, proserkamai, prosporuomai, genomai, and ami. Again, free variation seems to be the most plausible explanation for the translator's choice of translation equivalents for gur. Semantic variation. The Greek translator normally reveals a keen interest in clarifying the semantic content of unclear phrases or clauses in his Hebrew Vorlage. However, he occasionally leaves the meaning of difficult phrases or clauses unclear throughout his translation. To cite just one example of this phenomena, he sometimes leaves the notoriously difficult Hebrew phrase nasag yad, often rendered to become wealthy, unclear by translating it with a form of the verb heurisko and the noun care in Leviticus 5:11, 14:22, 14:30, 14:32, and 25:47. Nevertheless, in other instances, he clarifies the meaning of this phrase. Leviticus 25, 26, and 49 clarify the Hebrew phrase with a form of the verb eupareo, which means to prosper, and the noun care. Syntactic variation. The Greek translator does not abide by strict syntactic patterns in his rendering of the Hebrew. As just one example, he translates the nominal clause, Anoni Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God, as either ego eimi kurios or ego kurios. John William Weavers writes, no particular technique underlay his choice, end quote. Free variation guided him. Unintentional scribal errors aside, the Greek translator betrays a freedom to add to and subtract from his Hebrew Vorlage. In Leviticus 21:7, he seems to delete the second instance of the phrase lo yikahu because he regards it as unnecessarily repetitive. However, in Leviticus 23, verse 3, he adds the phrase to kurio to the clause, and in the seventh day, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, a holy convocation, to match the prepositional phrase ladonai in the final clause of the verse. Again, the Greek translator's motto is in all things variety. So those are just some general examples of his tendency towards variation. Now here in this section describes representative examples of 10 translation habits in the Greek translation of Leviticus 17 to 26. 10 particular characteristics, habits, practices of the Greek translator. Some of the translator's habits stand in opposition to one another, interestingly enough, demonstrating his proclivity for variety. So first, harmonization. The Greek translator consistently harmonizes a phrase or clause with other phrases or clauses in the same verse. He also regularly harmonizes a verse with other verses in the same chapter or with the broader book of Leviticus. Leviticus 18, 6-18 provides legislation forbidding various forms of incest in ancient Israel. Leviticus 18:6 introduces this theme by specifically forbidding an Israelite male from taking any of his relatives to uncover their nakedness. Legalot erva. Leviticus 18:7-17 uses this standard formula, the nakedness of X of so-and-so, you will not uncover. Leviticus 18 verse 18 then seems to register a critique of the patriarch Jacob's marital situation when it forbids an Israelite male from taking a woman as a rival of her sister to uncover her nakedness. The chief concern of this section is the prohibition of uncovering a relative's nakedness, that is incest. The repetition of this clause throughout the section demonstrates as much. Moreover, in most of the clauses in Leviticus 18:7-17, the verbal phrase, nakedness you will not uncover, ervat lo tegale, immediately follows the subject of the sentence. However, in 2 instances, the verbal phrase does not immediately follow the subject in the Hebrew. The Greek translator observed this oddity and utilized his normal habit of harmonization to solve the apparent problem in Leviticus 18:11. He simply added the clause, uk apokalypses, after his translation of the subject phrase, ervat bat eshet avicha, thereby changing the syntax of Leviticus 18:11 and matching it with the standard formula throughout Leviticus 18. However, interestingly enough, he did not follow this pattern in Leviticus 18:9. Instead of simply adding the clause uk apokalypses right after the subject phrase, he changed the plural noun their nakedness, ervatan, to her shame, aske masunein autes, to show that the prohibition in chapter 18 verse 9 concerns your sister from the beginning of the verse. He fixed this apparent problem with 2 alternative strategies. The Greek translation of Leviticus 18:9 and 11 reveal the translator's tendency to harmonize and, at the same time, his overarching principle of variety in translation. So harmonization is the first characteristic. Second is clarification. The Greek translator consistently removes ambiguities in his source text. He prefers to make the unclear clear and the implicit explicit at the phrase and clause levels. For example, the Hebrew text of Leviticus 25:50 reads, "Vechishav im konehu mishnat hi mochro lo." This clause admits 2 renderings depending on the semantics of the nifal infinitive construct in the clause. Then he will count with his purchaser from the year when he was sold to him, passive, or then he will count with his purchaser from the year when he sold himself to him, reflexive. The Greek translator selected the reflexive sense rather than the passive sense and clarified this in his translation. From the year when he sold himself to him, hiauton. He also demonstrates this tendency in his translation of metonymy. He prefers to translate the referent of the metonymy rather than the metonymy itself. Leviticus 24:12 records how the Israelites handled the man who cursed the name of Yahweh. Then they set him in custody to inquire for themselves by the mouth of Yahweh. the Greek translator clarified the referent of the metonymy al pi Adonai by translating it as through the command of the Lord, diaprostogmatas kuriou. If the Hebrew text invites clarification, the Greek translator often accepts the invitation. Third, simplification. Now, in contrast to his tendency towards clarification, the Greek translator sometimes reveals the opposite tendency. That is, the tendency to simplify his source text. When he follows this practice, he sometimes obscures exegetical possibilities in his source text. Leviticus 20 verse 20 affords one example. The Hebrew text condemns the man who sleeps with his aunt and the aunt as well, as follows: their sin they will bear, childless they will die. The Greek translation collapses these two clauses into one, perhaps suggesting that the second clause explains the first, and therefore only the second clause needs to be rendered, that is, childless they will die, or as you see there, ateknoi apathanuntai. The Greek translator simplified his source text. Explicit exegesis number 4. The famous maxim rings true in the Greek translation of Leviticus: all translation is interpretation. Moreover, like many of the Septuagint translators, the translator of Leviticus makes overt interpretive moves in his translation. Leviticus 21, 5-6 provides two examples of interpretation in the Greek translation of Leviticus. First, the Greek translator adds a prepositional phrase to the first clause in the Hebrew text of Leviticus 21:5. The Hebrew reads as follows regarding the priests: they will not make bald spots on their heads. The Greek translation reads, and baldness you will not have on your head for the dead, epi nekro. The Greek translator added this phrase from Deuteronomy 14:1 to explain the prohibition in Leviticus 21:5. But second, the Greek translation of Leviticus 21:6 translates the Hebrew lexeme lechem, normally translated food or bread, as dorah, meaning gift, to avoid even the slightest notion that the sacrifices belong to God as his food. Again, John William Weavers writes, the term dorah is completely neutral. Sacrifices are gifts for God. They are not food for God, which in an Egyptian context would be a dangerous notion. The Greek translator of Leviticus slips exegesis into his translation from beginning to end. The Greek translator misunderstood his Hebrew source text in a number of instances. Complicated Hebrew grammar, or hapax legomena, normally caused his misunderstanding. Leviticus 26:34-35 uses the uncommon hofal stem with the verb shamem to depict the desolated land. Leviticus 26:34 reads, then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days that it is desolated. The Greek translator mistook the hofal infinitive construct, hoshama, plus the third feminine singular suffix, for the noun shemama, plus the article, plus the third feminine singular suffix. It's desolation. Additionally, the hapax le'eker, meaning member or offspring, in the phrase, or to the member of the clan of the resident alien, seem to confuse the Greek translator in Leviticus 25:47. Therefore, he supplied a generalized translation of the phrase, from the birth of the resident alien. Now, on the other hand, the Greek translator at times demonstrated an acute understanding of the Hebrew language and his Hebrew source text. For example, the Greek translator renders the noun ish, which normally means man, as hekastos in Greek, which means each. In the clause ish imo ve'aviv tira'u in Leviticus 19:3, because he understands that ish can mean each The noun ish can mean each in the Hebrew Bible. The Greek translator also recognized the telic function of the Hebrew vekatal in Leviticus 23:40. And you will take on the first day the splendid fruit of the tree, and you will rejoice before Yahweh your God for 7 days in Hebrew. The Greek translator translated this verse as follows: and you will take on the first day the beautiful fruit of the tree in order to rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days in the year. These examples show that although he sometimes misunderstood his source text, the Greek translator often had an acute understanding of the Hebrew text. Like all Septuagint translators, the Greek translator committed unintentional scribal errors while producing his work. He probably committed the error of parablepsis based on homoiarchton in Leviticus 22:32. The Hebrew text reads, and you will not curse my holy name, and I will be sanctified in the midst of the sons of Israel. The Greek translator most likely skipped over the yod on kodshi because of the similarity between the yod and the vav that begins the next word, venikdashti, especially in ancient Hebrew manuscripts. The yod and the vav were often look very similar. He renders this verse as, and you will not desecrate the name of the Holy One, and I will be sanctified in the midst of the sons of Israel. As another example, the Greek translator probably metaphysized the letters samik and pe in Leviticus 23:39 when he renders be'osfechem et sevuat ha'aretz as soon to leseta, presumably from the verb aphis. Although many more examples could be adduced for this and the other characteristics, these sufficiently demonstrate the translator's tendency to commit scribal errors. Now, in contrast to the previous habit, the Greek translator sometimes understood the consonantal text in a different manner than the later Masoretes understood the consonantal text. The Greek translator consistently renders the phrase mikra kodesh or mikra-e kodesh throughout Leviticus as designated holy, klete hagia or kletas hagias. This rendering reflects an alternative understanding of the bound phrase mikra kodesh than the reading tradition in the Masoretic text. It's coordinate adjectives in the Greek translation against an attributive genitive phrase in the Masoretic text. Moreover, against the Masoretic vocalization, the Greek translator sometimes appends the first lexeme mikra to one clause and the second lexeme kodesh to the second clause. Leviticus 23:7 reads as follows in Hebrew: on the first day you will have a holy convocation, mikra kodesh. However, in the Greek text, Leviticus 23:7 reads as follows: and the first day will be designated. Holy it will be to you. These differences do not necessarily reflect scribal error on the translator's part. However, they do reflect an alternative understanding of the consonantal text than the understanding of the later Masoretes. The Greek translator sometimes switches third-person statements to second-person statements throughout the Holiness Code. Again, that's Leviticus 17-26. Leviticus 17:1-7 outlines the place of sacrifice for the priests and the sons of Israel. In the Hebrew text, the final clause of Leviticus 17:7 reads, a perpetual statute this will be for them throughout their generations. However, the Greek translator renders this clause as an eternal statute it will be for you throughout your generations. The Greek translator demonstrates the perpetuity of this ordinance either by framing the speech as directed at the ancient recipients of the divine revelation from Moses, or by framing the speech as directed at his Hellenistic Jewish audience. The Greek translator exhibits this translation habit inconsistently, of course, throughout his translation of Leviticus 17 to 26. Finally, final characteristic that I want to mention, and there are more, I limited myself to 10 for the purposes of this paper. The Greek translator discloses his knowledge of the Samaritan Pentateuch at numerous places in his translation by choosing to follow the Samaritan Pentateuch rather than the Proto-MT. The Hebrew of Leviticus 22:5 reads, "Or anyone who might touch any creeping thing by which he might be unclean." Sheretz, a creeping thing. The Greek translator renders sheretz as herpetu akathartu, following the Samaritan Pentateuch's reading, sheretz tameh, against the MT, sheretz. Now, either 4 or 5 of the translation habits outlined above are on display in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. Variety, clarification, unintentional scribal error, simplification, and acute understanding of Hebrew grammar. The translator's penchant for variety explains why he chooses to translate Eved and Amah inconsistently in chapter 25, verse 44, as Pais kai padiske at the beginning of the verse and Dulan kai dulain at the end of the verse, but by contrast chooses to translate the two instances of Asher consistently as Hasoi in 25:44. Moreover, the addition of Eisen to the translation of the Hebrew nominal clause Asher sevivotechem may be an instance of linguistic clarification. The translator either committed an unintentional scribal error in Leviticus 25:45 or simplified his source text when he rendered, "Who are with you who were born in your land," as "who were born in your land." The translator either committed parablepsis from the first Asher to the second Asher, or he simply intended to simplify his source text. Moreover, he demonstrates acute understanding of the Hebrew language when he renders the vekatal as a cohortative clause, and "they will become your property," as "let them be," the imperative, the third singular imperative, "be a possession for you." The Greek translation of Leviticus 25:46 may provide an example of simplification when the translator renders "to inherit as property, permanently they may serve you" in the Hebrew, as "and they will be your property forever." He may have simplified la reshet achuza and removed bahem ta'avodu because he regarded it as redundant. However, it is also possible that he committed parablepsis by skipping over bahem ta'avodu because the mem, as you see there on le'olam, and the bait on bahem, the next word there, would have looked similar in ancient manuscripts. And because of the similarity between the vav on the end of ta'avodu and the beginning of the next word, uv achechem. Moreover, it seems likely that the translator clarified the meaning of "you will not rule over him with harshness" by indicating how the Israelites could have ruled over one another harshly, that is, with much labor. And tois machtois. This paper has attempted to undermine the literal verse translation, free translation groupthink prevalent in Septuagint studies by outlining some of the specific tendencies of the Greek translation of the Holiness Code, and by defining its translation character in terms of these tendencies rather than in terms of literalness or freedom. The case, however, is not closed. Further research into the translator's habits in Leviticus 1 to 16 and chapter 27 could undergird the claims made in this paper. Moreover, this theory of translation technique should be applied to other literary collections within the Greek Bible to demonstrate the salience of this approach. The present author hopes to pursue these paths in future research, and he invites other researchers to do the same. Thank you.